Okay, lesson one of the second topic, the League of Nations. And this key question is a little bit different than the first, and we're looking at the degree to which the League of Nations was a success. Now, most of us can probably say, what's the League of Nations? It doesn't exist anymore, therefore it must be a failure. But of course, in all things in history, the answer is far more complicated than that. So how did the question really, and why the League of Nations was formed in its first place, was based on the question of how to stop the war. And of course, this was on the minds of the Allied powers pretty heavily by 1917, 1918, as it looked, maybe not in the immediate future in 1917, as no one could have predicted when the war was going to end, but it was certain anyway that it was going to end, and it was probably going to end with an Allied victory. That said, several leaders met during the First World War to talk about what could potentially happen after the war. The first real meeting that led to the organization of the League of Nations took place between Jan Smuts of South Africa, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, and David Lloyd George of Great Britain. And these leaders considered a variety of ideas. Number one, they wanted some sort of narrowly focused organization that would meet to sort out disputes and crises. They wanted an organization that would be backed by some sort of international army that would exist in a way to enforce the peace settlement. So in other words, if the Germans, for instance, broke the peace settlement, instead of having the army of Britain, let's say, enforcing the League of Nations, there would be some sort of international army that would exist to enforce the peace settlement. And they wanted the organization to be broad enough that it would address a wide range of international problems, not just the invasion of another country, but it would look after refugee crises. It would look after issues to do with the colonies and the governance of foreign colonies and issues and problems there, for instance. And moreover, they wanted a place where a wide range of these problems could be discussed and sorted out in a collaborative, collective manner. And this was the idea on which the League of Nations was formed. Now, the covenant of the League of Nations, or the Constitution, the set of rules or the aims of the League of Nations, was really around preserving world peace and promoting international cooperation on a wide range of economic and social issues, most notably, of course, disarmament. We do accept that it failed in its main aim because, of course, World War II started, and therefore the League of Nations was unable to prevent this major thing. But it doesn't mean it was a total and absolute failure. It did, as we'll come to find out across this unit, resolve a number of disputes and perform some very useful work in tackling a host of problems. Now, let's look at what the League of Nations actually entails. Okay, first and foremost, it's also very important to note that, like the peacemakers talking about Versailles, each of the major big three, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, and Georges Clemenceau of France, wanted each their own version of the League of Nations. And what we have when the League is created is a compromise reflecting the differing views of each of the major leaders. Of course, Woodrow Wilson wanted the League of Nations to be somewhat like a world parliament. Representatives of all nations could meet together regularly, decide on matters that affected all of them. British leaders like David Lloyd George wanted it to be a really simple organization that would get together only in emergencies, and an organization similar to something that had already existed. It was called the Conference of Ambassadors. And the French wanted a strong League of Nations with its own army that would be able to step in and, of course, naturally punish the Germans if they didn't do what they wanted. And in the end, really, you have a League of Nations that is more like President Wilson's vision of what it should look like. He thought that the League of Nations should become a major part of the peace treaties, and as such, he took charge of drawing up plans for the League. Now, what was agreed? He says that in the League of Nations, all major nations would join this League. These major nations would disarm to some extent. If they had a dispute with another country, they would take it to the League, and they promised to accept the decisions made by the League. In other words, that if there was two people arguing, the League would decide, and that decision was final. Much like arbitration in a labor dispute, if you ever encounter that or are familiar with how labor disputes are arbitrated. And of course, the League promises to protect countries that are invaded by another aggressive power. Behind the scenes in the creation of the League, there were tons and tons of worries. As ambitious and as, let's say, utopian of a vision, okay, utopian meaning perfect, of a vision of a League of Nations maintaining world peace. A lot of countries didn't like the fact that Wilson, who wrote these, showed a good deal of arrogance creating it. He believed he could solve all the world's problems, and he acted as if only he knew the solutions. And as such, people were sort of hesitant to support the League because they were, in a sense, put off by Woodrow Wilson. Others worried if countries would really do as the League said. Okay, well, you know, what if the League told them to do something and they just didn't do it? What would happen next? However, most still agreed that it was worth a try. And most thought, anyways, that if the USA led the League, the U.S., with its large army and large influence and, of course, large economy, could be a powerful peacemaker and actually make this thing work. The League was organized, and I'm not going to go into the basic details. You can read them for yourself. The League is organized into a number of key functions. The key organs of the League were the Secretariat, the Assembly, and the Council. The Secretariat is like the civil service of the League. They perform all the administrative duties. The Assembly meets once a year. These are the sort of representatives of each country meet. They consider matters of policy. They look at the budget, etc. And then they have the Council. The Council is there all the time. They're an executive body of the League. They meet 4 to 5 times a year in formality, and they will meet in times of crisis additionally. There are permanent and non-permanent members. The permanent members are Japan, Britain, Italy, France. Germany will become one in 1926. And the number of non-permanent members goes to 11 by 1936. So this sort of broad-speaking League of Nations had a solid backbone of countries. There were also a number of independent organizations that were associated with the League. There was a permanent court of international justice. Okay, this is the court who would decide how to help or sort of arbitrate on disputes. They would provide legal advice. There was an international labor organization. Of course, labor issues and the fight between workers and the owners of businesses was a humongous deal. The threat of socialism taking over, okay, and generally speaking, trying to get a better deal for the working class caused a lot of issues because of the amount of strikes and protests at the time. So they set up an international labor organization. And what it would do is it would meet representatives of government, employers, and workers, and it would try to promote good working conditions, to improve the standard of living, the rights of people, end child labor, etc., in the countries that were part of the League, and of course then therefore try to enforce these base standards on the world. Additionally, there are a number of commissions. There was a commission called the mandates. These would look after the mandated countries, i.e., for instance, Germany's colonies like Cameroon and Togoland were made mandates of the British. The British mandate in Palestine. The mandates organization would supervise the administration of the ex-colonies of Germany and Turkey to make sure that they were being not exploited to a large degree and the people in them were treated fairly. There was a mandates commission that looked after Danzig, that special area in the Polish corridor in which the League ran as a free city. There was one that looked over the position of minorities in countries, one that looked at intellectual cooperation, exchanges of scientists and intellectual contact between academic artists and writers to promote the betterment of all cultures. There was one on drug trafficking, very similar today, to prevent reduce the spread and the proliferation of drugs and harmful narcotics to the countries taking part in the League. So you see that it has a very broad and bold purpose. Now, there are some major weaknesses in the League's organization, which will be exploited throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. The first one, of course, was membership. The Assembly and Council would have been much more effective in their operation and in their influence had they been able to, or had they been representative of all the major countries in the world. And this is actually what Woodrow Wilson wanted to when he called for a General Assembly of Nations. The League was never in this position. There were too many countries that weren't willing to be part of the League, or too many countries, for instance, that the League didn't want to be a part of it. One good example, actually, before I move on is Soviet Russia. The Russians were not invited to be part of the League. The Chinese were not invited to be part of the League. These are countries with extensive population. Any country, of course, that was controlled by another, such as India, would not be welcome to be part of the League. So the League has some major weaknesses, with huge portions of the world's population, of course, not being represented by the League of Nations. Now, another major weakness in the League's organization was the United States of America. Of course, this is really, in many ways, the big one. The United States was the main inspiration behind the League. It was, of course, Woodrow Wilson who did the major drafting of the League of Nations. But as we know, the U.S. Senate would not ratify the Treaty of Versailles because for lack of other reasons, its major concern was that America would be drawn into future European wars to protect countries if they were part of the League of Nations. And therefore, Wilson was unable to get acceptance for the treaty, nor was he able to get acceptance for the League of Nations. And America, or the United States of America, did not actually sit in the League of Nations. It was deprived of one of the world's most powerful, influential, and wealthy countries. This meant that the League of Nations and its ability to take action against an aggressive country like Germany or Italy later on is significantly reduced. And generally speaking, the prestige of the League, without this major linchpin, perhaps at this point, even though the British Empire is quite strong, the most important country in the world, is significantly affected. One of the other weaknesses of the League has to do with the Germans. They're not allowed to join the League. In fact, they're expressly forbidden to join the League until they had demonstrated peaceful intentions. This made the League look like a club for the victorious powers. It gets closely associated by the Germans with the hated Treaty of Versailles, and those part of the League become sort of easy targets of attack by those politicians in Germany seeking to exploit anger and resentment towards the situation in World War I. Germany is eventually allowed to join in 1926 as a permanent member, but Hitler, again exploiting these divisions and harping back on the fact that the League was merely a club for the victorious powers, withdraws Germany from the League in 1933. So the people of Germany don't ever get to contribute this. And because they're not part of the League, the possibility of stopping Hitler through negotiations, perhaps, is severely limited once he withdraws Germany from the League of Nations. As mentioned previously, the Soviet Russians were not allowed to join the League. And the major reason they weren't was ideological. Communism, the sort of economic vision behind the Russians, was viewed as dangerous because it was committed to the overthrow of capitalism. And since the majority of the countries in the League of Nations were capitalist countries, they did not want to admit a country that was committed, quote unquote, to overthrow them. It would seem as dangerous. The Soviets, at the same time, did not necessarily want to join the League. Many of its members, Britain, France, and Japan, had actively been involved in trying to overthrow the new Bolshevik government led by Lenin in what's known as the Russian Civil War, which took place between 1918 and 1923. And by the 1930s, however, I should say that by the 1930s, things started to change, most notably because of the fear of Germany. The Soviets in Russia started to really, be concerned about the rebuilding of Germany, particularly under Hitler. And Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, agrees to join the League in 1934, if for no other reason but to have more friends in a potential war in the future against Germany. However, interestingly enough, Stalin does invade Finland, trying to take Finland back into the Russian Empire in 1939, and as such, he's expelled from the League. So his short time in the League of Nations was just that short. Other weaknesses include Japan and Italy. Two of the key countries in the formation of the League of Nations are actually two of the most dangerous to the stability of the League of Nations. Japan was one of the original members of the League, but leaves when it invades Manchuria, which is now a part of China, in 1933. And the Japanese are incredibly aggressive. It's something a lot of kids don't know about. In fact, the Japanese, throughout the 1930s, are expanding their empire in Asia to a large degree. At one point, it includes most of China, Vietnam. It includes the Koreas, as you'll find out later in Topic 5 when we look at the Korean War and the situation in Korea. But right now, you just need to know that Japan gets expelled from the League of Nations in 1933 for invading China. Italy, on the other hand, again, one of the original members, it leaves the League of Nations in 1937 after itself, under the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, invades the country of Abyssinia, which is composed mainly today of the country of Ethiopia and parts of Eritrea. Now, when he invades Abyssinia, the League of Nations acts against him by imposing very harsh economic and political sanctions, and as a consequence, Mussolini, to show his revulsion at the League for doing so and not letting him take Abyssinia, decides to leave the League of Nations in 1937. So you have two of its founding members, in an organization of peace throughout the 1930s acting aggressively to build their own empires and really going against the whole idea of the League. Britain and France, I guess, can be considered as well weaknesses of the League. These are the only major countries that are members throughout its entire existence. Both, of course, of these countries are massively weakened by World War I, both in the number of men they have available to be in their armies, but also their economy. These two countries held most of the responsibility for making the League more work, but most of these countries were distracted. Number one, by the economic issues of paying for the First World War, and also two, Britain really didn't want to involve itself in these sort of European organizations to a massive, massive degree. It was more concerned about maintaining its empire. France, on the other hand, was more concerned about increasing security against Germany. And in many ways, when coming to policy, the decisions of the League and the things that the League wanted took second place in the minds of the British and French politicians to what their primary concerns were, as stated, the empire and security against Germany. So the issue of collective security really goes beyond just the structural problems. If the League was meant to maintain peace, it would need a procedure and a force in which to deal, in which to do that with. In theory, what they devised seemed like a good way to police the world, but really the absence of the United States reduces the effectiveness of the League in both their moral disapproval. Of course, the United States, in many ways, is looked at as sort of the world's moral compass in this way. It doesn't have a major empire. It's very successful. It was led by progressives like Woodrow Wilson, who had a very open and future, forward-thinking vision of the world. And without this country there, the sort of the moral disapproval and the sanctions really aren't that bad. Of course, without being in the League of Nations, the United States could, let's give you an example, trade still with Italy, because it wasn't bound by the sanctions of the League of Nations. It could still continue on trade, which it actually does throughout the 1930s. Now, the issue of collective security was supposed to be sort of dealt with in a three-stage process that could be followed to stop an aggressive power. The first one, of course, is this idea of moral disapproval. The Council would meet and they would condemn the action. We see that happening today in the League of Nations a lot. The aggressive country, knowing it had the weight of world opinion directed against it, might drop an aggressive action. Now, if stern talking to or moral disapproval wasn't enough for you, economic sanctions could be put in place. Basically, they could say that we won't trade with you, we will refuse to lend you money or give you credit, therefore hurting your economy. And this can actually have a very powerful effect. A lot of countries today face economic sanctions for various actions that they commit, and this has can have a disastrous effect on the economy and force leaders, especially if they're accountable to the people, to sort of backtrack on unpopular opinions. And if economic and moral disapproval and sanctions don't work, you can have military sanctions, okay? This is sort of the last resort. A military sanction might involve sending an army to assist the victim of an aggression. And, this is sort of the ultimate step, but something that the League of Nations was hoping to do. Other problems with the initial setup of the League of Nations was the fact that a unanimous decision was needed by the Assembly or Council to make anything happen. It would take one negative vote, not including the vote from the aggressor, to prevent the Assembly or Council from acting. So let's just take a quick look. Let's say that, I don't know, back here. Let's say in a situation, economic sanctions against Germany weren't working. In Austria, who it might be on this, the Council, is friends with Germany because they're German-speaking people. And there's a vote, this is completely hypothetical, to put military sanctions on Germany. However, the Austrians are friends with the Germans. There are a lot of, ties both in language and culture, and they vote against your sanctions. It could be that all other 10 members of the League of Nations say, yes, we will impose military sanctions, but Austria says no. The idea of unanimous decision means that the League of Nations would do nothing. A majority, even an overwhelming one, was not enough. And this made it really difficult for the United Nations to make decisive action to prevent disturbances to the peace. And we'll see a few examples of this as we study the history of the League of Nations. And of course, the lack of an army. And this is the final point I'm going to make today. The League did not have an army, which meant it didn't have a standing force to call upon if it wished to impose military sanctions. If they were going to put in military sanctions, member states would be asked to provide troops toward a military force. They might ask the British to put in an air force, the French to put in their navy, or a combination of Navy, Army, Air Force from all of these countries. And this takes a lot of time. Of course, there's also no guarantee that the force that the countries are willing to send will be large enough to combat whatever aggressive power it is. And this really sort of ties the hands of the League of Nations. Therefore, military sanctions could never truly at any point be contemplated seriously, especially when a major country, that with a large army, is threatening the peace. Simply put, the lack of a large United Nations army and the fact that it would just be a piecemeal collection of whatever the other countries were willing to give would mean that the League of Nations, even though it had a military option, probably wouldn't be able to use it. So those are really the sort of the issues with the League of Nations. We'll look at, of course, all of these in greater detail, but we have a league, in summary, really, a league that has really high aspirations, an attempt to try and, police the world, make things better, prevent a catastrophe like the First World War from happening once again. However, a league that at the very same time is very much has its hands tied by sort of the deficiencies of its creation, and the major issue, of course, is the United States not accepting to be part of it, or the United States Senate voting against joining the League of Nations when Woodrow Wilson returns home from the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. That's all for lesson 1. Lots to talk about. Quite an interesting topic. Don't get bogged down in the semantics of it all. You'll pick it up over time. But anyways, that's it for lesson 1.